Lakeville, Indiana, April 1988. Lakeville was the kind of town people trusted without thinking about it. Not because it was perfect, but because it was familiar. The roads curved gently. The houses faced one another. Neighbors knew routines well enough to notice when they changed, but not well enough to question them. In 1988, Lakeville was quiet in the way small towns often mistake for safety. The Pelley family fit into that quiet seamlessly. Reverend Bob Pelley was known as a man of structure, predictable, disciplined. He followed schedules not out of obsession, but conviction. Faith thrived on order, and order was how he lived. His sermons were calm, never theatrical. He spoke about responsibility more than forgiveness, about accountability more than absolution. His wife, Dawn, balanced that rigidity with warmth. She was the connective tissue of the household, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who smoothed tension before it hardened. People who met her often left feeling steadier than when they arrived. Their daughters, Janel and Jolene, were young enough to believe the world worked the way adults said it did. Their home sat just far enough from the center of town to feel private, but not isolated. The kind of place where doors were locked at night, but curtains stayed open. Nothing about the Pelley family suggested risk. That assumption would matter later. The night they were killed did not announce itself. There was no argument heard by neighbors, no raised voices, no disturbance loud enough to trigger concern. The town went to sleep believing everything was as it should be. Inside the Pelley home, 4 lives ended. They were shot. Not randomly, not in chaos. The violence was controlled. That detail would haunt the investigation long after the blood was cleaned and the house stood empty. When the bodies were discovered, shock moved through Lakeville quickly, but shallowly. People spoke in disbelief, not fear. Murders happened elsewhere, in bigger cities, in places without familiar faces. This felt like an interruption, not a warning. Authorities arrived to a scene that raised more questions than it answered. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no evidence of a struggle that suggested panic or resistance. The house looked lived in, and then it looked like something else entirely. Reverend Bob Pelley was found where routine would have placed him, Dawn nearby, the girls close enough to suggest they had not run. That detail unsettled investigators immediately, because fear changes behavior, and nothing in the scene suggested fear had enough time to take hold. The initial theory leaned outward, an intruder, a robbery gone wrong, someone passing through. But nothing was missing. Valuables remained, doors were intact, windows untouched. The violence had a purpose, but not an obvious one. By morning, Lakeville was awake in a way it had never been before. The Pelley house became a landmark of disbelief. People gathered at distances that felt respectful but curious. Conversations overlapped, rumors formed before facts. Who would do this? Why here? Why them? What no one asked, at least not yet, was whether the danger had ever been outside the house at all. The early investigation focused on reconstructing the final hours. Investigators traced movements, phone calls, routines. They spoke to parish members, school contacts, neighbors. Everyone said the same thing in different words. They were normal. They were good. They had no enemies. Those statements were meant as comfort. They would later become obstacles. Because cases like this do not go cold due to lack of information. They go cold because the wrong story settles too early. And in 1988, the story Lakeville wanted was simple. This was a tragedy inflicted from the outside. No one wanted to imagine otherwise. Lakeville, Indiana, April 1988. By the second day, the Pelley house stopped being a home and became an object. Yellow tape framed it. Officers moved through it with careful detachment. Neighbors watched from porches, pretending not to stare while staring anyway. Inside, Investigators began the slow work of interpreting silence. The crime scene offered control rather than chaos. Shots had been fired with intention. There was no evidence of random movement, no indication that anyone had fled room to room, no overturned furniture that suggested panic. That absence disturbed seasoned officers. In most domestic homicide scenes, something breaks. A lamp, a chair, a pattern. Here, the environment remained eerily intact, which suggested compliance or familiarity. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the weapon used was consistent throughout the house. The shots were close range, precise. No indication of warning shots or hesitation. This was not a spontaneous act. The lack of forced entry became central to the narrative almost immediately. Doors were locked, windows unbroken, alarm systems undisturbed. Investigators debated possibilities quietly. Someone with access, someone trusted, someone expected. Those ideas surfaced briefly and were then set aside, because in a town like Lakeville, familiarity is uncomfortable to suspect. The alternative was easier. An intruder who knew what he was doing, someone transient, someone already gone. That explanation preserved normalcy. Reverend Bob Pelley's background became the focal point. His role in the community was examined not for motive, but for exposure. Who might resent him? Who might feel wronged? Who had passed through his orbit? Parishioners were interviewed methodically. Most described him as reserved, firm, principled. Not universally liked, but respected. Respect, however, does not equal safety. Investigators documented disagreements, minor ones, sermons that challenged, decisions that disappointed. None rose to the level of violence. Dawn's life was reviewed next. Friends spoke of routine, parenting, community involvement. No secret conflicts, no visible threats. The girls' lives were heartbreakingly small on paper. School, home, church, play. Nothing that explained why they had been targeted. And yet they were. That fact sat uncomfortably with the intruder theory. Criminals who break in to steal rarely eliminate entire families with such deliberation. They flee. They make mistakes. They leave traces. The scene did not feel rushed. Still, the investigation leaned outward. Law enforcement canvassed nearby roads, checked transient logs, reviewed vehicle reports from surrounding counties. The idea of an unknown offender moving through the area gained traction. It was something they could chase. What they did not chase, at least not aggressively, was internal contradiction. The timeline posed problems. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. No vehicles, no unfamiliar sounds, no late-night activity that stood out. For 4 people to be killed without drawing attention suggested either remarkable luck or remarkable proximity. The house's layout suggested familiarity. The movements implied knowledge of where people would be. Those observations were recorded, then deprioritized. As days passed, the town's shock calcified into ritual. Flowers appeared, vigils were held, the church filled with quiet resolve rather than questions. Grief unified people. Inquiry did not. The investigation's early direction hardened subtly. Leads that supported the intruder narrative were expanded. Leads that complicated it were set aside pending further review. That review rarely came. By the end of the first week, the case had a shape, one that fit Lakeville's need to believe this violence was an anomaly, not a mirror. A danger that came from somewhere else. That framing mattered. Because once a case decides where not to look, it narrows faster than anyone realizes. The Pelley murders shocked the town. But shock fades. Assumptions last longer. And in 1988, the most powerful assumption was this. Whatever happened inside that house did not belong to Lakeville. That belief would follow the case for 14 years. Lakeville, Indiana, 1988, 1992. In the months following the murders, the Pelley case remained visible, but not active in the way the public assumed. There were updates, statements, occasional reassurances that progress was being made. But progress in this case meant refinement, rather than expansion. Investigators narrowed instead of widened. The intruder theory, once established, became the spine of the investigation. Every new lead was evaluated based on whether it supported that idea. If it did not, it was logged and left dormant. This was not negligence, it was momentum. Law enforcement reviewed known offenders in surrounding counties. They cross-referenced violent crime databases. They interviewed individuals with transient lifestyles who had passed through northern Indiana during the spring of 1988. None produced a viable suspect. That absence should have triggered reevaluation. Instead, it reinforced the belief that the offender was gone. The case was treated as solved in theory, unsolved only in identity. This distinction mattered, because once investigators believe the danger has left the area, urgency changes shape. The community is no longer at risk. The crime becomes historical rather than immediate. And Lakeville wanted that reassurance. The Pelley home was sold. The church adjusted. Life reasserted itself in visible ways. People spoke about the murders less often, and when they did, it was with the tone reserved for tragedy rather than threat. Behind the scenes, the investigation entered maintenance mode. Evidence was catalogued and stored. Reports were summarized. Follow-up interviews became conditional, conducted only when new information surfaced rather than to generate it. Key witnesses were not re-interviewed. Timelines were not stress-tested against alternative scenarios. Assumptions made in the first weeks were treated as foundational truths rather than hypotheses. That approach had consequences. Small discrepancies, times that didn't align perfectly, statements that lacked clarity, were smoothed over. Ambiguity was resolved by defaulting to the established narrative. By 1990, the case had no clear direction forward, and when cases lose direction, they rely on time to deliver answers. Time did not. Leads dried up. Public interest waned. Media attention shifted to newer stories. The Pelley murders became something people remembered, rather than something they questioned. Internally, the case file grew thicker, but not richer. Updates referenced previous conclusions. New entries cited old reasoning. The loop closed quietly. One investigator later described it as waiting for the phone to ring. But phones don't ring on their own. During these years, alternative possibilities were occasionally raised, usually by newer personnel reviewing the file without emotional investment. Questions surfaced about access, about routine, about whether the crime required familiarity rather than force. Those questions were acknowledged, then deferred. The reasoning was consistent. Without evidence contradicting the intruder theory, reopening core assumptions risked destabilizing the entire case, and destabilization was not welcome. By 1992, the Pelley murders were officially classified as a cold case, not because all avenues had been exhausted, but because the ones being pursued had ended. Cold did not mean forgotten. It meant waiting. The danger of waiting is that it disguises itself as patience. Years passed. Investigators rotated. Institutional memory thinned. Context was replaced by summary. Details that once felt urgent became footnotes. The case did not fail dramatically. It simply stopped asking new questions. And in doing so, it allowed the wrong answers to settle in permanently. For 14 years, Lakeville, Indiana, 2002. The reopening of the Pelley case did not begin with revelation. It began with discomfort. When investigators returned to the files in early 2002, they did not search for new evidence immediately. They searched for the logic that had governed the case for 14 years. What they found was consistency, but not rigor. The intruder theory appeared everywhere, in summaries, in interviews, in assumptions that no longer felt examined, only inherited. It had become less a conclusion than a reflex. So the first step was subtraction. What if there was no intruder? Not as an accusation, not as a claim, as an exercise. When that question was allowed to exist, even hypothetically, the case changed shape almost instantly. The lack of forced entry stopped being puzzling. The absence of panic stopped being unusual. The controlled violence stopped feeling contradictory. Instead, those details aligned. The house was not breached. It was accessed. The victims did not scatter. They complied. The violence did not escalate. It executed. That alignment disturbed everyone involved, because it suggested that the case had never been unsolvable, only misframed. Investigators reconstructed the night again, this time assuming the offender knew the house, the routines, and the people inside. They walked the rooms with that assumption in mind. Timelines tightened. Movements made sense. What once felt random now felt precise. The review uncovered something else as well. Early investigative decisions had quietly closed doors that were never reopened. Certain interviews were never repeated. Certain inconsistencies were never stressed. The case had not gone cold from lack of effort. It had gone cold from early certainty. By mid-2002, the task force reached a conclusion that could no longer be contained internally. The original intruder narrative was no longer considered viable. That acknowledgement did not solve the case, but it changed everything. For the first time since 1988, the murders of Reverend Bob Pelley, Dawn Pelley, and their daughters were officially recognized as a crime that likely originated within the family's circle of trust. That phrase landed heavily. It did not point to a name. It did not announce guilt. But it shattered the illusion that danger had come from elsewhere. The implications rippled outward. Community members who had once dismissed the case as an anomaly felt a delayed unease. The idea that familiarity, not randomness, had enabled the crime-forced people to revisit old memories with new weight, and memory, when re-examined, is rarely comfortable. As the case gained attention again, media coverage returned. Not with shock, but with scrutiny. Articles asked why it had taken 14 years to reconsider the obvious. Commentators questioned how early assumptions could have gone so long without challenge. Those questions mattered. Because public pressure is often the only force that reanimates stalled accountability. First guilt, CTA. If stories like this make you uncomfortable, they should. Cases don't stay misframed for 14 years without silence helping them. Staying engaged, subscribing, watching through, refusing to look away, is how pressure survives when systems fail. The renewed investigation moved quickly now. Old evidence was re-examined, witnesses were recontacted, statements were compared instead of isolated. The house was no longer treated as a neutral backdrop, but as a participant in the crime. What emerged was not chaos, it was coherence. The case no longer asked what kind of stranger could do this. It asked who would be allowed inside without resistance. That question had been avoided since the beginning. By the end of 2002, authorities publicly acknowledged that the Pelley murders were being reclassified, not as a random act of violence, but as a targeted family homicide. The announcement was careful, but it was unmistakable. The story Lakeville had lived with for 14 years was wrong. And wrong stories don't just mislead investigations, they delay justice. Second guilt, CTA. Every year this case sat frozen was a year accountability didn't exist. If you believe time shouldn't protect failure, then sharing and supporting stories like this matters. Silence is how the wrong version survives. The uncovering did not bring closure, it brought confrontation. Because once the narrative collapsed, the case could no longer hide behind mystery. It had to answer for the years it spent asking the wrong questions, and that answer would not stop in 2002. It would move forward into consequence. Lakeville, Indiana, 2002 and beyond. When a case is reclassified, it doesn't move forward all at once. It sheds weight first. That was what happened after 2002 when the Pelley murders were officially reframed. The intruder narrative, so long treated as the backbone of the investigation, was quietly removed from internal language. Reports stopped referencing a transient offender. Briefings stopped assuming an outside threat. The case was no longer about who came in. It was about who was already close enough to be trusted. That shift did not bring immediate justice, but it did something more difficult. It forced accountability backward. Investigators reviewing the case now had to confront not only what happened in the Pelley home in 1988, but what had happened to the investigation itself afterward. They examined why certain paths were never taken, why some assumptions were protected from challenge, and how institutional comfort had shaped outcomes. The answers were not flattering. Early certainty had reduced curiosity. Community pressure had favored reassurance over disruption. Familiarity had been mistaken for safety. None of this was malicious. All of it was consequential. As the post-2002 investigation unfolded, it became clear that the case's greatest loss was time. Witnesses had aged. Some had died. Memories had softened or reshaped themselves around the old narrative. What remained was structure. Investigators rebuilt timelines using records rather than recollection. They re-examined statements for contradiction instead of confirmation. They studied the house not as a passive location, but as a controlled environment, one that rewarded knowledge and access. What emerged was not a single dramatic revelation. It was convergence. Independent lines of inquiry began pointing inward rather than outward, not toward a stranger, but toward familiarity, toward routine, toward the idea that violence had been enabled not by intrusion, but by proximity. That realization carried weight beyond this case, because the Pelley murders were no longer just a family tragedy. They became an example of how investigative framing can determine not only outcomes, but timelines. 14 years had passed before the right questions were asked, not because they were impossible, but because they were uncomfortable. The public, when finally presented with the reframed case, reacted with delayed shock. Many had lived for years believing the danger had been external. That belief had allowed the town to grieve without fear. The truth complicated that piece. It suggested that the violence had not arrived from nowhere, and that its explanation had been delayed by collective reluctance to look inward. The Pelley family, Reverend Bob, Dawn, Janel, and Jolene, had been remembered as victims of randomness. They were not. They were victims of certainty that arrived too early and stayed too long. The uncovering of the case in 2002 did not deliver arrests that closed the story neatly. It delivered something harder: correction. It acknowledged that the case had not gone cold because it lacked answers, but because it had settled on the wrong ones. That acknowledgement matters, because cold cases are not only about the past. They are about what systems learn, or refuse to learn, over time. The Pelley home no longer stands as it once did, but its silence still speaks. It speaks to how violence can hide behind familiarity, how narratives can protect failure, how long justice can be delayed when comfort is prioritized over truth. This is where the story ends, not with resolution, but with responsibility. Final guilt, CTA. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you already know this case didn't wait 14 years for answers. It waited 14 years for attention. Subscribing, sharing, and staying present is how pressure survives time. Silence is what lets failures age into history. The Pelley family was not forgotten. They were postponed. And remembering them now is not about closure. It's about refusing to let the same mistakes repeat. Quietly, comfortably. And unseen,